All right, football at 4, Sports Bash, John McMullen every day, 4 o'clock at JF McMullen. Football at 4, brought to you by the Route 54 Community Shuttle, a free shuttle service in Atlantic County, now running Monday through Friday with expanded service hours and connections with New Jersey Transit and AC Rail. A lot of news in Philly today. The Pleasantville-Camden football game is about to start, and we'll get you updates throughout the show here on the Sports Bash. I know Carson Wentz, Doug Peterson both spoke about it today. I see video and pictures of Fletcher Cox and Zach Ertz, and many of the Eagles are at the game as that game is about to kick off here shortly. We'll have updates throughout the day. And John McMullen was up at the NovaCare Complex today, of course, as the Eagles had their media availability. Doug Peterson spoke. We got a lot of news to get to, so let's do it. John McMullen here on Football at 4. What's up, pal? We got you there. Sorry, that was my fault.
That's fine. Yeah, some of the Eagles are over there, and some are shuttling back and forth because the locker room availability just ended.
All right, well, let's get into some of the things here that are kind of pressing. One, I guess most importantly, Lane Johnson in the concussion protocol, and it's very rare that a guy gets back in 1 week, but any feel on whether he'll be ready to go and what changes will happen if he is not?
Well, it's never positive. Obviously, if you're not out there on Wednesday, it's difficult to go through the protocol. It's a 5-step process. So all concussions are different, but it's not a positive sign. Eagles are pretty much confirmed. It will be Andre Dillard if Lane can't go, and he took the first team reps today.
So Dillard would be the guy. Vaitai would go back to the bench. It would be Dillard. How much right tackle work did he get leading up to? Is that why he wasn't the first choice last week?
Yeah, it was. We've talked about this a lot as far as cross-training. Eagles have not been proactive with that. So that's one of the things I've been disappointed with. And the fact that in-game you couldn't go to it tells you they weren't prepared for it. So I think it's fair to put a little criticism on the organization for that. Now that they can game plan, they can go into it. They're preparing with Dillard in mind, but they probably should have had that fail-safe already set up. I mean, that's a concern, no question about it.
All right. What's the story with Agholor, who was not present today at practice?
Well, remember, he tweaked his knee when he was awkwardly.
Are there air quotes there?
I mean, everybody saw it. You and I, Mike, specifically have talked about his inability to track the football for a long time. You saw it again on that particular play. He made it more difficult than it needed to be. And turns out he hurt himself on top of it. So he was not at practice today. So all of a sudden this team is getting really, really thin at wide receiver because Alshon Jeffrey's still not back practicing. He did some individual work, but he'll be listed as limited when the injury report comes out. So all of a sudden you look at no Jeffrey, no Agholor, and the only healthy receivers you have are Jordan Matthews, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, and Matt Collins. They have 3 guys on the practice squad. They could elevate somebody if they need to later in the week, but this is going to be a concern moving forward until you can get Alshon healthy. No question about it. And Nelson as well, even though he's not performed well.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is the situation with the practice squad guy? Because someone would have to be basically taken off the 53 if you're going to elevate, let's say, Greg Ward. All right, we're going to pull you up. Now you got to pick someone to kind of take off.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part. So you have to either release somebody, put them on injured reserve. Remember, the Eagles probably would like to have Jordan Mailata right now, but he's on injured reserve because they needed to create a roster spot earlier in the season. He's healthy. He's ready to go, but he can't practice. And you have to ask yourself from that standpoint, now that Lane Johnson might miss a week, You'd like to have them for depth, but you don't have them because of that roster juggle. So it's always difficult, and you have to make tough decisions. But there's certain guys who haven't played, Nate Herbig being one of them, Sharif Miller being another, rookies. One's undrafted, one's a draft pick, so you can pretty much understand how that would go. In other words, there's ways you can do it. And you could probably get those guys through waivers as well and get them back to the practice squad. But it's always you're always taking a chance. The Eagles took advantage of that with Marcus Epps. Minnesota was hoping to get him through waivers and get him back to the practice squad, but the Eagles picked him up. So those are the kind of things you have to weigh all the time in this league.
Yeah, I know that. And it's tough because a guy like James or Rudy Ford, those are guys who play special teams. To just take them off the 53, you're going to the special teams aspect of it. So when people say, why not just bring up Greg Ward, sometimes there are other repercussions, unless you're just willing to ready and willing to just release or cut or ties with Agholor with 6 games left.
Yeah, and they're not going to do that. It's been pretty clear. I mean, if anyone is thinking that could be a potential option, it's not. I mean, this team, almost to a man, from Doug Peterson to Mike Rowe to all his teammates, have sort of jumped on the sword for Nelson Agholor, and they're trying to protect him. And look, there's 2 things to this. I don't think there's any question that this is his last year as a Philadelphia Eagle, but they're not going to pull the plug early. One of the reasons is, to be honest, they're embarrassed by the evaluation to begin with, and the fact that they exercised what was a $9.4 million team option. They didn't have to exercise that. They probably shouldn't have exercised that. So you don't want to create that look for your organization to say, wow, we got this so wrong. We're going to eat this with still plenty of time left in the season when you're still in the hunt for the NFC East Championship. That's a terrible look for Howard Roseman. It's just not going to do it.
One thing is, too, that Agholor, do you deem that he is a productive enough guy if he stays in the slot? I mean, he does drop the ball from that position sometimes, too, but it seems that his drops are more a product of when he has to track the ball.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There was one bad drop at the sticks earlier in the season, I think in Atlanta, I think in that game. And that's really all the other ones were a product of just what you said. And it kind of tells you he's just not an outside receiver. And he gets better in the slot. And Mike Rowe admitted that yesterday. He had his one good year when he was allowed to stay in the slot. He didn't have to move around.
So how do they even contemplate moving him out of that position? I mean, they got to see what we see, right?
Well,
or are they telling us that we're wrong?
No, I mean, he verbalized it. So he understands it. He actually said it. So it's not like they're disagreeing. But what they're saying on top of it is that because he's a smart player, because he understands each position, because he can handle it from a mental standpoint, from an understanding of the scheme, the offense perspective, that he's better than the other options. That's where the divergent view comes, and that's where the paths change. And we go down one. Most people go down one. The Eagles are going down another. I think it's pretty clear he's not giving you enough. He did give you enough as just a slot receiver. So to me, it's pretty simple. Leave him in the slot and play the younger receivers outside, at least until Alshon is back, and you can make a decision to play either JJ or Mac Hollins, depending on how you want to go about that. I think that's the best way you can go about it. Eagles think differently, and even more so, as I said yesterday on the show, I mean, Nelson, because of his pedigree, and he's a first-round pick, and he's been so disappointing, and I talked about that $9.4 million option to me, the worst part is Jordan Matthews, who comes in off the street in the 11th game and the 10th game of the season, week 11, and plays 85% of the snaps and takes snaps away from J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. I think that is borderline dereliction of duty from the Eagles. I really do.
Today there was a question about DK Metcalf and, what they thought of him leading up to the draft and why they were persuaded. And Doug kind of deflected that one as that's a personnel side question, almost indicating, hell yeah, I'd rather have DK Metcalf.
Well, I think people say that, and they point to all these names, and it could be DK, it could be Terry McLaurin from earlier in the season, any of these receivers that were drafted near JJ or even below, and they see what they're doing in other organizations and other teams. But what they're missing is the second part, and the second part is the opportunity. I don't know if those guys are here. It's any different. I can't prove that. It's not provable positively or negatively. But there's if they don't know the offense, and let's be honest, most young players have difficulty picking up schemes, at least entire schemes. And if you're not going to use them judiciously and use them for what they do well, they might not be on the field either. And you might be saying the same thing about these players.
Yeah, so I do agree with that. Where you are is a big factor.
Yeah, so I think people are assuming the opportunity would be here, and the only reason JJ is not playing is because he's bad. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think other young receivers would be in the same conundrum in the fact that this coaching staff is not good on using players that are not well-rounded.
Yeah.
And you have to do that. Mike, this is different from a talent perspective. It's night and day because I always say I think Randy Moss is the most talented receiver of all time. I got to see him in his rookie year in 98. I think he had 17 touchdowns. He ran 2 routes. So if Dennis Green was like this coaching staff and said, well, Randy Moss, he doesn't know the offense, I'm not going to take advantage of his skill set.
Right.
You have to use players that are limited. And I think that's where this coaching staff has failed.
John McMullen at JF McMullen, football at 4, 97.3 ESPN. What about the Howard stuff? You mentioned that he might not play, but how will the running back situation, he has that stinger, how will that kind of materialize? Did you get a better feel on what they feel about that spot this week?
Well, Jordan's not cleared for contact again, so I think that's a concern moving forward for another week. And I do think it's going to be interesting. Doug talked about Jay Ajayi today, and he mentioned he's here because of Darren Sproles' injury, and he is going to have a role moving forward. So part of that I don't like, because when Jordan's here, and if he's here and if he's healthy, I don't need him to have a role. And Doug, we've talked about this in the past as well, is too in love with that committee approach. And I think the Eagles stumbled onto something because of the original injury to Darren Sproles. And once they were kicking on all cylinders with Jordan being the lead back and Miles Sanders being the change-up and the guy who can catch it out of the backfield, I thought that was working out really well. That was the strength of this offense in a lot of ways. They were starting to get an identity. And now all of a sudden, I think we're going to be back to committee approach, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be a good thing, at least when Jordan Howard gets healthy. When he's not healthy, I think it's great that Jay's here because he's a similar type runner, and hopefully you can at least copy some of what was going on with Jordan Howard. But if they're both going to play and Miles Sanders needs his touches down the road, I don't like that. I really don't.
Now, Zach Berman asked this week, you asked last week, is there a role for Ajayi? He says, yes, I think there's a role. And this week, if Jordan can't go, obviously, again, then that role would increase. It has to increase from nothing to something. But, there was a little clause in his contract that suggests that the Eagles might want to bring Jay back in the future here. So can he be a guy that they can create something around? Or is there, that knee and his workload, is it too much to suggest that Jay can be the back that he was beforehand?
Well, there's always a concern. There was a concern before the ACL because he has knee issues dating back to his college days at Boise State, and he's got a degenerative knee condition that has nothing to do with the ACL he suffered last season. So I don't know if he could ever be a lead back, a guy who can touch it 20 times at this stage.
Which I guess in today's game you don't have to have, right?
Yeah, but that's kind of what I was getting at. I think from the contract standpoint, look, that's just a safety net, and that's actually a smart move by Howie Roseman because Jordan Howard is a pending free agent after the season. So, we know how this organization values that position from a monetary standpoint. So they might not be able to get a contract Howard if there's interest elsewhere. And if other organizations are willing to go too high, then all of a sudden you have a safety net and you have a similar type player in Jay Ajayi. Whereas if you do get something done, you could say, okay, we have an option to match. We don't want to match, and you just move on. So I just think that was a smart little thing that Howie put in the contract, and it could be relevant. It could be meaningless depending on how things shake out with Jordan Howard.
What is the thought with Bradham and his availability? And you wrote about him today and what the plan could be. Whether Jim Schwartz thinks, hey, this is the right guy to get back out there, or is Geary a guy that they got to figure out, or is Camus a guy they want to play? I mean, where does Bradham kind of fit in, and do you think that he will play this weekend? What does Schwartz have to say there?
Well, I do think it's trending positively that he's going to play. And there's no doubt. I mean, when Nigel's going to be out there, he's going to play. I mean, when he's healthy, he's cleared. He's the number one linebacker on the team. The question comes in, where does he play? Is he going to be the Mike linebacker? Is he going to be the guy handling the communication? That's something Nate does very well. Ken Flajoul mentioned that he's smarter than me. He's the linebackers coach. So they really like the communication aspect that Nate Geary gives that particular defense. And, oh, by the way, they've been playing very well since he has been in there orchestrating things. So the question becomes, do you put Nigel back into that quarterback role on defense?
Right.
If you do that, then I think Camus Grugier-Hill is the second linebacker. If you don't, and you let Nate handle the communication, be the Mike linebacker, Nigel is the other linebacker. So it really comes down to what way they want to go from that preference standpoint. And it kind of, I think Camus had his best game since coming back from his knee injury in training camp against the Patriots. I think he played really well. But I think you said there's a disconnect between the fan base and what Jim Schwartz thinks about Nate Geary. Jim Schwartz thinks a heck of a lot more about Nate Geary than most of the fans do. And I think we might have another Jalen Mills situation developing.
Yeah, well, a lot of people think Mills is playing to a point where they would have to consider something with him.
Yeah, I mean, if he's been one of the best cornerbacks in the entire NFL over this last 3 game span. And that's a very small sample size, and it's a sample size that includes Josh Allen and Mitchell Trubisky. So there's a lot of context in there. But if you look at, you've seen the other corners on this team, and a lot of them have, not a lot of them, all of them, have better pedigrees than Jalen Mills from a draft standpoint, from a supposed trade standpoint, and he's better than all of them, and he is. And I think anybody who denies that at this point is kind of exposing themselves as they don't know what they're watching, because he has been the biggest defense. And I tweeted out today about the inversion of this particular game coming out, the Eagles and the Seahawks. Typically, you think about the Seahawks as great defensively. Well, they're number 4 in offense. They're number 24 in defense. typically you think about the Eagles and Doug Peterson and Carson Wentz about their offense. Well, they're 23rd in offense. They are now ninth in defense in the NFL. They have a top 10 defense after all the hand-wringing. And a lot of that has to do with Jalen Mills coming back. It really does.
Yeah, and it's the one reason why I feel like this team can kind of find their way if they can just get their offense going, is because their defense has finally kind of gotten there. And a couple of years ago, John, it was 2017. The Eagles were kind of the Seahawks. They were kind of the good team that was, we weren't sure who they were quite yet, but, we felt they were really good. And then they traveled to Seattle and got waxed in that game. They just didn't have it that day. Seattle's almost in the same spot where they got to travel now across the country, and we feel that Seattle's good. We're just not sure who they are yet, but we're not, that Seattle team, we were like, they're good, but they're not. Philly right now, Like, it feels like if Seattle is going to be for real, they come here and win this game, and if not, they travel across the country and they have that letdown game. Doesn't mean they can't pick back up, but that letdown feeling seems like the way that Philly will have to kind of win this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I just mentioned the inversion of offense-defense from the Seahawks, also home-away. I mean, typically they have been so dominant at home over the years that in many ways has been the toughest road environment in the NFL. All of a sudden this year they're great on the road. They're so. They've lost both their games at home. And they've won. We always talk about West Coast teams coming east for the early window. It's 10 o'clock in the morning for them. Well, they've won 5 straight times doing that.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're not capable of doing that. But I don't see this team as so dominant that the Eagles can't play well and get out of Lincoln Financial Field with a win. Because if you look at their strength, in the Doug Peterson era, there's 2 teams, New England and Minnesota, that are better at home than the Eagles, even after the loss to the Patriots. So they've been very good at home for a long time now in the Doug Peterson era.
All right, we got plenty more on this game all week long. We'll start to dive a little bit more into the matchups. Where is Seattle really tough? Where do the matchups kind of swing one way or the other? John McMullen has more on the Eagles-Seahawks at 97.3 ESPN.com. Follow him at JF McMullen on Twitter. And don't forget, every day, 4 o'clock, football at 4. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, Mike.